Good evening. Thank you all for coming out at the end of such a glorious day for what will be an interesting discussion. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, so welcome again. We are privileged to have Adele Morris back with us. Adele's a regular. We don't actually invite her anymore. She just shows up. So she has been with us from the beginning. One of the first scholars we brought out when we started this experiment. So we're delighted to have her back. She has developed many connections here, both on campus and in the community. She's engaged in research projects with UNLV faculty, such as Helen Neal, sitting right in front of me here. You will see and hear more about her work with UNLV students tonight. And Adele's academic background includes degrees from Rice, University of Utah, and Princeton, an interesting triumvirate, if there ever was one. Adele's, of course, had extensive experience in the government as well as at Brookings. She is, as I constantly hold her out, the poster person for what a Brookings Fellow should be. We're just grateful for everything she's done. She speaks in classes. She, in fact, has helped develop the economics course that's part of the Brookings undergraduate minor that's available. And she's working on grants with UNLV faculty, so she has left no stone unturned. And tonight we're going to hear about some of her current research relating to the carbon tax question. And I know it will stimulate some questions, and hopefully there'll be time at the end for a few of those. Adele?
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. I want to start out by thanking Bill and all the folks at Brookings Mountain West for their incredible hospitality. I know Las Vegas is a town that excels in hospitality, and Brookings Mountain West is certainly a shining example of that. The work we're going to talk about tonight is joint with Matt Kinzer, who's a graduate student in the economics department here at UNLV, and my colleague Tracy Gordon, who has been a Brookings Mountain West fellow. She was out here, I think, just a couple weeks ago. And that rascal, she's now working at the White House for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. So Brookings just lost her, but she's still involved in this project. And I want to thank my colleagues for their help with this project. I also want to thank UNLV because independent of Brookings Mountain West, UNLV has provided some grant support for this research. And they provided Matt's time to work with me, not just on this project, but as a research assistant for some of my other research, including research with Professor Helen Neal. So there have been a lot of wonderful collaborations, of which this is part, and so it'll give you a flavor of some of the work we've been doing. Tonight my discussion is around the potential for a state-level carbon tax. And I'm going to focus on some issues around the Intermountain West, but primarily Nevada, and look at some of the issues in Nevada. Some of the results I'm hoping under other work to kind of expand to other states and see what to kind of broaden the, here we go. Broaden the work. So I'm going to start with the science. You know, there's no sense talking about a carbon tax unless you care about carbon. And why do you care about carbon? It's because we're worried about the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide being a major component of that. And because this is really recent, I just thought I would start with a couple slides from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're just started to issue the results in what's called the Fifth Assessment Report, or the AR5. And this is from the summary of policymakers of the first working group, which is the science, the people who look at the relationship between the buildup of greenhouse gas concentrations and what it might do to global mean temperatures and oceanic temperatures and that kind of thing. So the first part of this brand new compendium of the science, it really underpins earlier findings that we are seeing the Earth warming, and that's a graph of the change in surface temperatures that we've already observed in the post-industrial era up till 2012. So this is historic warming, and we see already that we're up to over a degree centigrade in trend warming in some parts of the planet. And the second thing is, what should we expect going forward? And the lesson from this slide is that it really depends on the emissions trajectory. So these human-induced contributions to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are a function of economic activity and choices of energy sources and deforestation and a whole bunch of things that humans can make choices about. And the difference between those two scenarios is reflected down here. The most stringent policies, and these are very ambitious measures that could be undertaken, would still see significant projected warming, but substantially lower than an emissions and concentration scenario that essentially is unabated by any special policy measures. So you can see that, you know, there's a whole range of potential emissions and concentration scenarios and the temperature prospects that would go with that. And so in any of the scenarios that are more like that one and less like that one, there are significant policy measures that need to be undertaken. So obviously I'm not the scientist, I'm the economist, but I just want to start from the premise that this is the state of the science, this is the consensus of this enormous international group, the scientific body. This is the report that's just been approved by governments worldwide. And so the story there is in red. We're going to require substantial and sustained reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm starting at that as our premise, and then I'm kind of working my way into now what could we actually do about it? What are the practical implementation options? So that's the scientific lecture for tonight. Now the rest of it's going to be on policy and nuts and bolts and economics. So the underlying problem, as you know, is that when we use our fuels, the prices we pay don't reflect all those damages to the environment. They just reflect the costs of producing, marketing, transporting those fuels, but not those environmental damages. So what economists routinely say is those prices need to reflect the damages so that people take those into account in everything that they do, everything they buy, and all their services and choices in the economy. And a carbon tax can do that. If you can come up with some kind of monetization of the damages, you can put that tax on the fuels and in proportion to the damage that they cause. Or you could have a cap and trade system, as some different countries have adopted, and how we've done for acid rain and sulfur dioxide in the United States. Either of those approaches could work, some, advantages and disadvantages of each, but we don't have that. What we have now is a very complicated set of federal subsidies and mandates and standards and existing regulations and prospective regulations under the Clean Air Act, a whole bunch of different measures, all of which might have very different costs of abatement. Some will be a lot more cost effective than others, but it's really kind of a hodgepodge, and there's really not much prospect right now for that to change, certainly at the federal level. And as anybody who's watching Congress now realizes that the chances of Congress agreeing on much of anything is pretty slim. So the question is, what really can be done? Certainly the EPA can regulate, and that's kind of where we're going right now at the federal level. The president announced in June, he instructed the EPA, first of all, EPA re-proposed a rule that would control greenhouse gas emissions from new power plants, okay? And that's scheduled to be finalized, that rule, next year after a period of public comment. and possible revision. But that's supposed to be finalized next year, and the president instructed EPA to issue proposed rules for existing power plants. Now that's a big deal. And those rules, he instructed them to come out with next year. So this is a composition of where US greenhouse gas emissions come from. And this big blue wedge is existing power plants. Okay, that's our electric power industry. So that's existing stationary sources of CO2. That's what we're talking about regulating starting next summer. That's a big, big chunk, not just of emissions, but of the American economy. That would be like one of the biggest Clean Air Act rules, if not the biggest ever. So then he's instructed EPA to finalize that rule in 2015. Then what happens, assuming everything stays on track, and it has a way of not doing that with various litigation, the states have to do implementation plans. So under this part of the Clean Air Act, a lot of it would have to be implemented by the states. And every state would have to figure out, okay, what are we going to do in Nevada? Are we going to follow this part of EPA guidelines, or are we going to do something else? Every state's going to have to come up with that, and then EPA is either going to approve that or they're going to reject it. And there's this whole process by which all that is done. And there'll be an important role for the states in that. And some states might have plans that the EPA won't like, and then EPA has to have federal implementation plans and enforce that. And frankly, it will be a very protracted and messy process. And there's a good chance it won't end up being all that economically efficient, depending on how they go forward. So what can states do then? So that's, I give you the federal picture. What can states do? Well, states can adopt policies to reduce their emissions and at the same time promote new clean energy technologies or energy efficient technologies and kind of show Washington the way. The challenge, of course, is that if you do it, in this part of the US or that part of the US, you don't necessarily have a coherent set of incentives across the US economy, right? And you could end up driving economic activity from one state to the other just by virtue of having different levels of ambition. And frankly, that doesn't make much economic or environmental sense. So on the one hand, you want states to take action because the federal government's not doing it. On the other hand, states working alone, kind of in isolation of each other, you're likely to end up with fairly disparate rules and maybe not as much progress as you might otherwise have. So what are states doing? Well, we have several categories of actions. Some are mandatory measures where, like we have renewable energy portfolio standards where a certain share of electricity has to be produced with a particular set of either renewable or clean energy technologies. There's different sets of how that might work. There's something called net metering, where some states require electric utilities to buy extra electricity produced by people who have like solar rooftop panels. And so people then have an extra reason to adopt those, purchase those panels. They have energy efficiency codes and standards of various kinds. And in terms of energy standards, just think no further of the fuel economy standards for cars. California, it tends to be on the ambitious side, and then they have an influence over the federal standards because they're so big. So that's mandatory measures. Then there's also other, what you might call incentives, whether it's tax rebates or direct spending or loan programs. There's a whole host of those things. So let's just dig in a little bit to what we have there, and Matt's going to tell us a little bit about Nevada. These are the renewable portfolio standards, some of which are goals, which are yellow, and the standards, which are mandatory, are green, although the yellow and the green look a little bit similar. So there's Nevada. We have here in Nevada, one of the more ambitious sets of renewable standards, with our neighbors from California also being quite ambitious, and Oregon and Washington also have standards. And so I'm going to give this over to Matt, and he's going to talk a little bit about Nevada in particular and some of their policies.
Hello, everyone. Just along with what Adele was saying with standards, in Nevada right now, it's 18% of all retail sold electricity has to be renewable energy. And so out of that 18%, 6% of that 18 must be solar renewable energy. So Nevada has a focus that's mandatory on solar energy right now. So Nevada's other policies towards clean energy, you have, we have our renewable and clean energy portfolio standards we talked about. We've adopted the International Energy Conservation Code, which is a building code. It ensures that new buildings are all up to code and energy efficient on a level that's standard with many states and many counties and many municipalities across the country. Nevada's goal is to have 90% of new buildings be up with compliance by 2017. We have retrofitted grants, which is a program to help public buildings and businesses with older buildings. It helps them to finance increasing their energy efficiency. We also have something called Nevada Energy Fit, and that's for local homeowners. It's a low interest loan program, short-term loans to homeowners with low interest, and if they make at least a 20% increase in their energy efficiency for their home, if it's assessed they made a 20% increase, then they get a grant funding them back. So not only do they pay the loan back, but then they also get a rebate. So they get a monetary transfer to them for making their home more efficient. And then we also have tax expenditures. So not only are we mandating programs, mandating our electrical companies sell certain amounts of renewable energy, and not only are we having programs that let people voluntarily make their house more efficient, we have programs that are funding new renewable energy plants being built in Nevada. So there's a sales tax on new renewable energy plants. There's also for LEED certified buildings, like on campus, I believe Greenspun is LEED certified, correct?
You're in one of the greenest buildings on campus.
Yeah. Those buildings have a 25 to 35% abatement on their property tax, so that cuts down their property tax. And there's also on the property tax for renewable energy power plants is up to 55% over 20 years. And so these are actually pretty substantial amounts of money. So you can think of over a 3-year period when you build a brand new renewable energy plant, so a new solar energy plant, a new thermal energy plant. For 3 years you get your decrease in your sales tax, and over those 3-year periods totaled these are all the projects that have been approved for the state of Nevada. It's $161 million. So over a 3-year span, $161 million is pretty substantial, especially for the shortfalls Nevada's been having when we're trying to balance our budgets. And then for the 20-year property tax values, you're getting up to almost $350,000. You're getting pretty close there. And that's another substantial amount of money. And so this isn't funds, this is funds that the state is giving back to companies to incentivize them to invest. A lot of people try to think of tax cuts as not as transfers to individuals or transfers to corporations, but these are actually programs where the government is essentially cutting a check to people to invest in new renewable energy. And so we think that this kind of highlights that we are spending money on renewable energy and we're losing revenue. And so this lost revenue needs to be made up somewhere. I'll turn it back over to Adele.
And I would just add, and that's for solar power that's already mandated, right, by the renewable electricity standards. So in some sense, you're compensating them for something that they were going to do anyway. So anyway, so whether that's high or low is kind of a matter of the perspective, but certainly it's an investment and it's non-trivial lost revenue. Oh, and by the way, some of that is lost revenue to local governments. It's not just the state government. Some of that property tax would otherwise go to local governments. Okay, so that's a kind of a snapshot of what we're already doing. So why would you do a carbon tax? And why would states even think about this? Well, as we've seen, we have a whole host of different measures. We might want to try to do something that's likely to be more cost effective and create even incentives to abate across all different fuels, and not just adopt renewables, but maybe switch from coal to natural gas, neither of which are renewables, but natural gas has about half the emissions of coal on a per energy unit basis. And we might need to raise revenue, and I'll show you some pictures of the budget situations around the country. And you might want to use that to reduce budget deficits at the state level, buy down the debt at the state level, or you might want to shift your tax system and put the taxes onto sources of pollution and away from economic activity that you actually want to encourage in your state, whether it's working or saving or investing, that kind of thing. Another option might be that the EPA, remember those Clean Air Act rules I was talking about? They might be able to design those in a way that allows state implementation plans to be a price on carbon, in fact, a carbon tax, as opposed to some kind of emissions standard. So there's a possibility there. So if you did a carbon tax, what would you have to decide? Okay, there's a few ingredients that states would have to grapple with, and these would be very similar at the federal level if we did that. First of all, you have to have a tax base. What is it you're going to tax? Is it going to be just CO2? Is it going to be methane emissions? Which sources? I mean, some sources of methane might be easy to identify, others might be tough. Like you might be able to tax methane from landfills, but it might be tough to tax methane from animals that produce it when they digest their food. Probably a little tougher to do that. So you got to figure out your tax base. Then you have to set your tax rate, and generally economists would advocate starting at a more modest rate and ramping it up gradually, so you turn the economy over and gradually to more emissions efficient structure. You got to figure out what to do with the revenue, and I'll talk about some options for that. And you have to manage the distributional outcomes. By that I mean, look, poor families probably are in no position to bear any kind of higher costs of energy. So even if you use the revenue to reduce other taxes, you still got to worry about poor families who may find higher energy prices very burdensome. So you might want to try to reserve some of the revenue to target to the poorest households. And then you got to deal with the problem that we were talking about earlier, where if you've got a tax in one state, what do you do to try to mitigate the flow of economic activity to other states? So you want to think about that and decide whether or not your carbon tax is going to supplement all that stuff we were showing before, or whether you want to replace all that stuff I was showing before, and different people will have different views on that. So is this just made up by the likes of people in think tanks in Washington? No. People are actually talking about this. The state of Washington, there's some folks trying to get a ballot measure on the ballot for a year from next month, and they're collecting signatures, and they actually have a fairly concrete proposal exactly what the tax would be and how the revenues would be used, and I think they're fairly serious about it. Oregon actually just passed a bill in August to commit to doing a feasibility study of a carbon tax in the state of Oregon. Massachusetts actually already has a bill that's under consideration. It would be $5 per ton of CO2, and most of that revenue would go back to the taxpayers of Massachusetts through reduction in other taxes. So we are talking about it in the US. And there's noises in various other states, but those might be the ones you hear the most about. And many states that are talking about this are really looking to a particular model, and that's in the Canadian province of British Columbia. They've had a carbon tax for, I want to say, something like 4 years now, a little over 4 years. I think it came in 2008. It's ramped up gradually. It's now at $30 Canadian per ton of CO2. It's virtually entirely revenue neutral, which means they've used that revenue to reduce corporate income taxes and personal income taxes, and then they had some targeted payments to poor households. And by all accounts, it's done very well in British Columbia. The economy in British Columbia has stayed strong relative to the rest of Canada. Fuel use has declined. That more hospitable business tax environment has invited investment. And it looks like, you know, if you were to try to paint it as a job-killing energy tax, I don't think that's been the experience in British Columbia. Of course, it is still early days, but by all accounts, you know, British Columbia is still up and running and everything seems to be going pretty well. So now, when I talk about a carbon tax, let me just talk a little bit about what that does exactly. So what I have in mind is the excise tax, and by that it's a tax on a thing. In this case, it's a tax on a ton of carbon or carbon dioxide, whichever you prefer, that's embedded in a fuel, and you can tax that before the fuel's even burned, because you know how many tons of carbon are in any particular fuel. So there's a little chart. Coal has about 25 kilograms per carbon per million British thermal units, and natural gas has about half of that, and then gasoline is in between. So the point is to change the relative prices of these different fuels so people will change which fuels they use. It doesn't mean they can't use coal, it just is going to cost them more than it did before. And what's not on there is renewables, because they don't emit carbon. They start looking that much better relative to everything else, right? So if they have a cost disadvantage without a carbon tax, they might still, depends on what the tax rate is and what their economics are. But the whole point is to align incentives to look for the cheapest ways to abate revenue. Now, or abate emissions. Now I'm talking about revenue. So this is a chart that suggests where states are having the most fiscal difficulty. So this is from a Washington Post article, and you can see out in Nevada and California and Oregon, there are some fairly serious state level budget shortfalls. Now there are other states also that have those, but you know, those might be the states that are in particular looking for new sources of revenue. And here it is as a sort of more concretely as a percent of the budget. Nevada's up there as one of the top 2 states in fiscal shortfall. Now I realize there's a budget amendment that requires a balanced budget. Whether that's followed through on and exactly what the accounting mechanisms to make that work are a separate issue, but clearly Nevada's been through a lot, and their revenues have really been a source of challenge, to say the least. So if Nevada did, so let's drill a little bit on Nevada. So what's its emissions? Because that's the tax base, right? So like I said, it's really tough to tax all of the emissions, but the easiest ones to kind of get at from an excise tax administration perspective would be this black wedge, which is coal for electricity. Red would be natural gas for electricity. And you can see what happened with the recession, just how much the economy declined and what that did to emissions. Like I said, emissions and economic activity are very tightly aligned, and you can just see the Nevada economy collapsing between 2005 and 2010. But also what was going on is we were switching from coal to natural gas to fire what electricity we were still using, right? And then the yellow wedge is petroleum, you know, gasoline and diesel. So those would probably be pretty feasible to tax. And then you could probably get at some of those industrial emissions. And that royal blue wedge, that includes natural gas burned at the household. You could probably tax that as well. not necessarily at the household level, maybe at the distributional points. Getting at agriculture is really tough, and some of the waste gases might be tough, but you could probably get at about 40 million metric tons of current emissions with an excise tax. And if your tax was $10 a ton, that's $400 million of revenue that you could use. Now, what could you use it for? Obviously, you can patch deficits. Another option, if you were looking for a tax swap, something revenue neutral, that's a graphic of where Nevada currently gets its revenue. The biggest blue wedge that says operating grants, that's mostly money from the federal government. That's things like grants to states for Medicaid, things like that. I'm guessing that's not what we would offset. There are a bunch of other taxes. One opportunity might be to roll back in whole or in part the modified business tax, which is a tax on Nevada wages. It's paid for by the employer, but you can pretty much guess that gets capitalized into the wages for workers. So that might be one option. But again, that would be something that Nevada could choose for itself. So I did a proposal. I'm not usually in the business of doing proposals, but I was approached by our Hamilton project to put together, kind of an illustrative plan of how it could work at the federal level. And something sort of like what I proposed at the federal level could be feasible at the state level. And there's a little bit of parallels with how British Columbia did it. So, pinned to the wall, I had to think, okay, what would I propose? So I suggested something that would start about $16 a ton and ramp up at about 4% over inflation, so it goes up in real terms. Get as many of those feasibly identifiable sources of carbon and other greenhouse gases. I would also, as part of that package, reduce the spending on other clean energy, because I think if you're in the business of trying to patch our big federal budget hole, you wouldn't necessarily layer this on top of all that other stuff. You might use it to replace it. So we have a bunch of subsidies that I sort of estimated we might be able to roll back from. And at the same time, I would say, look, if you're going to have a carbon tax, maybe we could suspend the process of regulating under the Clean Air Act till we see how that carbon tax would work. And in my proposal, I reserve 15% for the poor, which you could either give out through electronic benefit transfers like we do food stamps and other assistance, or you could do it to shore up other programs that benefit the poor. In my proposal, I used a big chunk of the revenue to lower corporate income tax rates. And that had two purposes. One is we know that the corporate income tax is one of the most economically burdensome ways to raise revenue because it discourages investment. So in the economic modeling that we've done, we've shown that there's a potential if you replace capital income taxes, which is like corporate income tax, capital gains, and dividend taxes, with a carbon tax, you might actually get a pro-growth effect because you're exchanging a less burdensome tax a more burdensome tax with a less burdensome tax. So that was the idea, so that nobody could call this something that was going to kill jobs and, the usual talking points. And then the rest of the money I would reserve to reduce the deficit. Now, why did I pick $16? Okay, this is more art than science, but there's a whole set of different benchmarks we could use, including the estimates by the Obama administration of what that actual social cost of carbon is. A range for that might be between $12 and $40, depending on what discount rate you use to monetize damages in the future in current dollars. And there's a bunch of other programs, from the EU trading system to the carbon tax in Colombia, or in British Columbia, to the carbon tax in Australia, which may not have much of a future, and a bunch of other programs around the country and the world. $16, it's on the low end, you know, kind of what I think the reaction's been good, because some people said, Adele, that's way too high, and other people say, whoa, Adele, that's way too low. So maybe somewhere it would be about 16 cents a gallon of gas, if that's of any help. So why did I pick the corporate tax rate? Well, to lower, this was the US tax rate compared to other countries back in 1981. Now, they all lowered their corporate income tax rates, and we didn't. So this is where we sit relative to other countries. Now, to be clear, this is the marginal statutory corporate income tax rate, which is different than the effective tax rate once you take into account all these various tax preferences and exclusions and what have you. So it's not exactly the right thing to think about in terms of incentives for investment, but you get the picture anyway. And both candidates for president agreed that we needed to do something like this. And so I think it might have some support on the Republican side in the realm of things you could do with the revenue. And there's some of the estimates of what the net deficit reduction would be from my proposal. So why am I talking about a federal tax? Because a lot of these issues, there are very analogous state level considerations that states would have to grapple with, and opportunities that would arise. So if there's not a federal carbon price and states wanted to think about this, it makes a lot of sense to not just have Washington go off and do one thing, Oregon go off and do something else, California goes off and does AB 32, and then we've got this state level hodgepodge that looks a lot like all the different renewable standards and all the other things I was showing you earlier. Ideally, we would, have the Governors Association or somebody kind of coordinate and try to think through how states could, it doesn't mean everybody has to do the exact same thing, but it helps a lot if they talk about how they could coordinate. Well, then when it comes out, well, if the states lead, what happens if the federal government follows? Then a lot of interesting challenges could arise, because the state's already taxing carbon, and then the feds tax it too. What could happen? Well, that actually happens now with the gasoline tax. I guess there's several layers of taxes. There's Clark County, there's Nevada state taxes, and there's federal taxes, and there's different earmarked trust funds or what have you for each of those streams of revenue. So you could layer that just like you do with other kinds of excise taxes, or the states could rescind it, or you could try to work out a deal with the feds to get them to collect the tax, but then give some of the revenue to the states. And that's not out of the realm. There are precedents for that. So what happens if a state adopts a carbon tax and then the EPA goes off and regulates? So this is where it gets interesting, because it's not clear whether the courts would uphold an interpretation of the Clean Air Act that would result in a state imposing an excise tax on carbon, because the statute is vague. This part of the statute, 111D, has never been used at this kind of scale. There's really no precedent. There's no legal, track record for how courts would interpret this kind of flexibility. But certainly, it's something that states could try. EPA might even be in a position to provide a safe harbor. We'll see how that goes. So just to conclude, and then I'll invite some questions, I would say a carbon tax could work at the state level, and we've seen it work at the provincial level. And British Columbia is a big enough economy that I think it does provide an example. Ideally, we'd have more examples out there to see a variety of approaches and see, what's worked and what hasn't. But clearly, it has some potential. and there's a lot of flexibility about how to manage that revenue. Can be managed in a pro-growth way. I think it would do something serious to reduce CO2 emissions. I haven't shown you estimates here, but I'm hoping to develop those about how much you could actually reduce emissions at the state level. But hopefully you do that in concert with other states, so you limit the amount of emissions that leak out to other states through distortions in investment and that kind of thing. And maybe we could find a way to use a state level excise tax to supplant much more complicated and heavily command and control type rules that might come out under the Clean Air Act approach. So I'll conclude there, and I'll welcome your comments. And Matt, if you want to come up and field any questions, please do. Sure.
Well, a wonderful talk. I heard your other one. It's a very, very interesting talk. And I think that I focused more of my attention on the health aspects of these things. And I know rather than arguing over tenths of degrees, I think you can look at some of the health impacts, and certainly when you get to coal. But your map also indicates just how much of this warming now is occurring in Asia, particularly India and China. India uses lignite coal profusely, and you can see that. So what about the idea of, and I like to prefer to use the term fee, because it would go away.
There's a lot of ideas for
I like the word
euphemisms.
fee 'cause it goes away if you quit doing it.
Yeah.
So anyway, but the idea that if you're going to sell here, we're going to put a fee on the product coming in. And again, I would like that to be paid by the people wanting to do the business here,
Right.
rather than the individuals that could be impacted more. But anyway, what about that?
Yeah. So if
leverage?
if we had a federal level carbon tax, and I mean, my understanding is under WTO rules, we can't just slap a tariff on goods for which there's no equivalent for U.S. products. So this would be in the context of having a federal level carbon tax. What do you do about imported products? Certainly you would put a tax on the carbon in imported primary fuels. If you're importing oil, that would get taxed. Then you'd have the question, what about energy intensive goods? Maybe it's metals or chemicals or pulp and paper. There are a few categories of goods that we know are intrinsically energy intensive. And in that case, there would be a number of approaches you could do. You have to be really careful about avoiding World Trade Organization violations, because you don't want to start a trade war, and you don't want your climate policy to be a vehicle for protectionism and untoward trade barriers. On the other hand, the lawyers I've spoken to have suggested that carefully designed border carbon adjustments would be feasible, but you'd have to kind of be careful about what goods. Like, some goods are like a car, so complicated, figuring out what the carbon content, where parts are manufactured all around the world, and with umpteen different methodologies. You might have to tailor such a adjustment to a relatively narrow set of goods, but it is feasible.
Yeah, that is the concern of the American energy-intensive industries, that they'll do a carbon tax. I've heard CEOs about this, and their concern is if you're making steel, next thing you know, you're paying either through the electrical power or through the CO2 you emit. Then you're going to be disadvantaged in the international market without that kind of offsetting.
Right. So there's, what do you do about energy intensive imports, and what do you do about energy intensive exports? And on the export side, I've heard diametrically opposed positions of different lawyers. I know that never happens, but in some cases I've heard, no, we couldn't do that. Other cases I've heard, yes, totally, you could have a rebate of the carbon tax to the energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries upon export. So that would definitely be something you need to grapple with, but it really is a relatively small share of economic activity for which those concerns arise. Politically very salient and certainly very important for those industries, but I would just contend those concerns should not obviate the idea in its entirety. Yeah.
Well, on either your proposal or maybe in British Columbia, at what point in the chain of the possible release of the carbon does the tax get imposed?
Right. So I would do it fairly upstream, where there's kind of a choke point in the distribution system of fossil fuels. So the Congressional Research Service estimates that if you do it now you could do it at the mine mouth for coal or at power plants. For oil, you could do it at the wellhead or at refineries. For natural gas, you could do it at the processors. But you could cover 80% of US greenhouse gas emissions by taxing under 2,500 entities, which is incredibly efficient from a tax administration standpoint. Now, we all know the people who send the check to the government are not the people whose pocketbooks are made worse off. Clearly, those price signals would be passed through downstream, largely to retail consumers of goods who have carbon in their supply chain. But that's kind of the whole point, right? Hang on, let me just see if there's anybody else who wants to jump in. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, you mentioned how the poor would get relief, because I've noticed here in Las Vegas that the poor have pretty fuel inefficient cars. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the fleet since like 2000, the fleet of the average person's driving their car, it's pretty fuel inefficient, and they last pretty long, these cars now. Now, how these poor people now, how would they get relief from this carbon tax? Like, you have any specific examples?
Yeah, so I think it's easiest to say what the worst idea is. The worst idea is to subsidize energy bills for the poor, because you really want to maintain the incentives to conserve energy for everybody. But you can hold poor households harmless by supplementing other sources of income to compensate them. So my calculations with a colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Aparna Mathur, suggest that reserving about 15% of the revenue and targeting that to poor households, like I said, you could shore up Medicaid or food stamps or other social safety net programs for the poor. You could give little electronic purchase cards, debit card type things. Any number of approaches. I think maybe states would have different views about what would be best in each state. But about 15% of the revenue would hold the poorest 20 to 30% of households completely harmless. So, that would be one, rough estimate of how you could do it. But see, the problem is, the more you reserve to lower burdens on poorer households, the less revenue you have to do this pro-growth tax reform that increases investment and makes the U.S. economy more competitive for new business and so on. So there's kind of a trade-off there.
That's theoretical too. Like, it's not true that tax cuts increase. Like, it hasn't been true.
Well, it is true. We know there's good evidence that different taxes.
You've been playing this for what,
right.
5 years now?
So different tax instruments have different propensity to discourage different kinds of activities. And we have pretty good evidence that taxes on investment discourage investment, and over the long run, that's not a good thing relative to taxing something else that would be less damaging to economic growth. So we know there's some taxes are a lot more efficient than other taxes. And the question is, if you can do a pro-growth tax reform and get environmental benefits and get deregulatory benefits, you know, can you kind of combine these things into something that works? Yeah.
So I have just a kind of a two-part question. One is, you know, obviously cooperation in the Intermountain West would be ideal, but I don't think it happens in reality on very many issues. And trying to coordinate something that would take effect and, you know, within a decade in the West would be, I think, pretty impressive. So what does Nevada do, especially with a smaller economy compared to many of the other states, especially California, if we wanted to advance something like this forward? And specifically,
That's a good question.
when it comes to the tax issue, since we don't have a corporate income tax here or an income tax at all at the state level, what would you do with the revenue generated from a carbon tax in Nevada?
Great questions. So now for California, because they already have AB 32, they just, on the last auction, I guess that was I want to say in December, for the 2015 allowances, priced at about $10 a ton. So I think if Nevada went to the $10 price point, you're really, I mean, it's modest enough. You're not going to create a lot of competitiveness issues, certainly with the California economy. And, you know, it's not big enough to really be decisive in a lot of investment. But it's big enough to, I think, kind of accelerate the trend of shifting from coal to natural gas and a lot of the other things that have already driven the Nevada economy to be more emissions efficient. In terms of coordinating, I mean, you're absolutely right. So it's a little bit of a dream world, but if you're modest enough, a lack of coordination shouldn't be a deal killer. And what would I do with the revenue? When I looked at the budget situation in Nevada, I think in good conscience I'd have to say shore up the fiscal system and use it to fund government for now. And maybe later on when the Nevada economy is stronger and the you know, the state coffers are a little bit more on solid ground, and I was looking for what might be both a pro-growth tax reform and something that, you know, would benefit, you know, a good preponderance of Nevadans. I might go for that modified business tax on payrolls. That might be something I'd think about unraveling with the revenue from excise tax, but that might be a little further down the road. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering, how far away would Nevada be from taking on a carbon tax? So in other words, has there been any champions of a proposal like this to go forward?
You know, I would welcome anybody here in Nevada who knows the answer to that. I haven't heard of it. I mean, I'm talking about Nevada because I'm in Nevada. Yeah, I know that it's been a topic in other Western states. I think given the exigency of the budget situation in Nevada, if you're casting about for new revenue sources, I would look to carbon because it's better to tax pollution than economic activity directly. Now, do I have any delusions about the, you know, the political winds that are just going to whip this into inaction? No, I don't. But I think kind of it's up to people in think tanks to try to point out what might be useful ideas, even if, you know, people don't seem to be listening, because sometimes that's actually how ideas begin to gestate. You never know. Yeah.
This question might be too soon, but you referenced it. Last month, the Labour Party in Australia lost their majority in Parliament, and the Liberal Party, which we would call conservatives, you know, won the majority, and they saw that as a mandate to repeal their carbon tax. and it didn't have a lot of popular support. And I'm wondering, just from a comparative policy perspective, if there are some lessons learned. I know it's not repealed yet, but they're pretty confident that it will be. So are there some lessons learned, something we could avoid if we were to move forward with a policy like this?
Yeah, that's actually the title of a paper I'm working on, Lessons Learned for the U.S. from the Australian Carbon Tax Experience. Yeah, so I think there are lessons learned, and I'll know better what they are when I'm done with my paper. Okay, here's what my going in thought before I've actually really completed the research. And you know, we all like to speculate what our research results are going to show. But one thing is, you know, when Australia adopted that carbon tax, they went straight to $24 a ton. Now, Australia is a very energy intensive, very trade exposed economy. And as I've been discussing all evening, there's some real risks associated with disparate carbon prices when you're in that kind of energy intensive trade exposed condition. So one might have accused them of a little bit early ambition for $24 a ton. Another thing is the way they managed the revenue arguably did not create the kind of buy-in that the British Columbia approach did. Now they're up to $30 a ton, and they're very, you know, trade-oriented province, but they've used all the revenue to reduce other taxes with some targeting to the poor. I'm not sure the Australians managed their revenue quite that much, and I think they even did some things that created a worse net revenue picture for them. Also, another thing is because it wasn't sort of handled methodically, there was always a lot of uncertainty. Well, is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? And that is exactly the wrong thing, because remember, this is a generational problem. It's not what bill you pass, it's what bill you keep passed. And because if you're going to decarbonize the economy and stabilize concentrations, you got to have your policy robust through all sorts of macroeconomic ups and downs. It's got to have the buy-in of the people. So they really didn't handle that well, and they didn't give investors confidence about what that price signal would be. Also, in part, they were transitioning, it was very peculiar, and I can't say understand it yet, to a cap and trade system. So they start with a tax and convert to a cap and trade system because they wanted to link to the EU. Well, look at what the EU prices are, okay? That, what is it down to? Under $9. I think it's even less than that now. Closer, what? 4.5 euros, okay? So why would you do abatement in Australia at $24 a ton if you knew 2 years later you're going to be facing $4 a ton? And that's just exactly backwards. It's better to start with more modest prices and predictably and gradually ramp them up so that people can invest in, you know, different equipment and energy efficiency. I mean, ideally, you know, you erode that tax base as fast as you ramp up the tax rate. You know, that's the whole point, right? Eventually, you're going to end up with no revenue, but we should be so lucky, right, that we're not emitting that carbon. We'll just have to find some other source of revenue. Yes?
Do you think that there's any advantage to offering a discounted rate to generation schemes like cogeneration, biofuels, landfill?
So you have to answer that question, I'd have to ask, is there some other benefit that's conferred on society by a particular technology? Like Nevada has this carve out for solar. Well, from an environmental perspective, why do you care about solar versus wind versus energy efficiency versus geothermal versus switching from coal to natural gas? You don't. Economically, you just say, protect the environment and do it as cheap as possible. But the reason for the carve out, you guys may know it better than I do, but the idea is we're going to have an industry and we want to promote it and provide a market for it. as an economist, I need to be convinced that the benefits broadly to society of those carve-outs or special provisions don't just accrue to particular industries, but there are spillovers to the, you know, average Nevadan that make it worth the kind of distortions that those special provisions create. But from an environmental perspective, you know, it'll depend on exactly what you're looking at and what benefits might be accruing. So maybe one last question
Yes.
back.
Would someone like a last question, please?
I have a question about Sweden must not have any carbon at all. They have $156 tax.
I know, it's impressive, isn't it? You know, there's an incredible willingness to pay in different places around the world. I mean, people are in various countries are just simply passionate about the issue, and they might be endowed with, you know, a lot of hydropower or geothermal. I mean, I think it's Iceland that's even talking about decarbonizing because they have all that geothermal energy. And for those places with certain special endowments and certain strong preferences, they're willing to do that. And and then they're able to reduce other taxes as well.
What is Sweden?
I don't know. Hydro? Nuclear power. Nuclear? Yeah. Well, they got something or else they wouldn't have that price. I can pretty much figure that.
Let me thank Adele. Let me especially thank you for all your great questions.
Thank you all for coming. And thanks to Matt.
I'm going to encourage Adele and Matt to please keep thinking and bringing ideas back to us. You'll get this kind of feedback and engagement, which is great. Going to get Adele out of here. She'll have time if you still have a question or two to ask, but she's got a class to teach at 7 o'clock. We can't stop her from helping us here. But thank you. Next week, you get a vacation. We don't have a lecture, but we'll be back here in 2 weeks. If you can join us, we'll have colleague Ross Hammond out, and we'll switch topics to a social issue of obesity in the nation, and it's an issue for Nevada. So I hope we can see you then. Thanks again for coming.